Okay, so now we're going to head into our exercise, and our exercise is going to be about just getting the paint on the paper and playing around with the colors that we plan on using. And you don't have to stick to your palette for your final project. You can play around with whatever colors you've got. You can also try color mixing. We're going to talk about values a little bit. When you are painting with watercolor and using a watercolor brush, watercolor brushes are designed to hold water, so make sure that you have plenty of water on your palette and that you have your brush loaded. Don't wipe your brush off like this and then go to your paper. That was a habit that I had to get out of when I first started painting in watercolor. I had painted in oils and acrylics, and having a lot of paint on your brush when you're painting in acrylic or oil is not super beneficial. So watercolor is kind of the opposite. You can wipe it a little bit on the rim of your glass here, your water glass or jar, or maybe just touch it to the paper towel, but be mindful. You want to have water in your brush, and you want water on your palette, and you're going to increase or decrease the value. And when I talk about value, I mean the lightness or the darkness of it's the same color. It's just this is really light and this is a really dark version of the color. You can create some really nice effects if you understand your value scale. So right now we're going to get a lot of water on the palette, and you can also invest in one of these little bottles. These are great. It saves some time as far as getting water down on the palette. So I've got a decent puddle, and the more water that I have down on my palette, the water to paint ratio is what determines your value. So I'm going to start off with this, and I have plenty of water and paint on my brush, and I'll start painting. I'm going to make sure that I'm not anywhere near a block that's already wet, because what happens is water follows water, and if I were to paint, and I know this edge is still wet, if I were to paint next to this, it would bleed right in and would jump right into that square. So I want to let that dry first. So when you're painting, you can get used to skipping around because you want your other blocks to dry. You're doing the same thing in your project. You're not going to paint right next to a wet square. So we'll start somewhere over here, and this is going to be a pretty light value of that orange color that I have on my palette. And as you can see, I'm not outlining my square. I'm kind of painting this shape. I'm going to get a little bit more. You want to have a nice wet edge too, but don't outline your shape. And the reason for that is that if for some reason, and these squares are fairly small, so you probably wouldn't have to worry about it, but as you move on to painting bigger objects, if you outline your shapes, those edges will dry first before you can get to filling them in, and then you'll have a dried outline, which will be really obvious, and you don't want to do that. Basically what you're doing, you're pushing a puddle of paint around. That's how I feel when I paint. And as I come to the corners, and I want straight lines, I try to hold my brush a little bit more perpendicular to the page so that I can get kind of a nice sharp corner. As you're painting this and we start working on the smaller squares, you're going to lose some of the sharpness, and you're going to have edges butt up against next to each other, and they will create a darker edge, and that's perfectly fine because this is supposed to be kind of a whimsical look anyway, and it's an illustration, and imperfection is just part of the process. We don't need to be super perfect with this. This is more about practice. So as you can see, this has a lot of water in it. There is some pigment in it, but it's a nice light value. So if I decide that maybe my next square I want to be darker in value, then I'm going to pick up some more paint and I'm going to drop it into that puddle. And if you do it on maybe half the puddle, I try to keep them kind of away from each other a little bit. That way I've still got my diluted puddle over here. So if I want to go back to it, I can. It's as simple as adding more water over here if I lose some of this saturated puddle over here. So this is the same color. It's just a really dark value of the same color. And like I said, we're just we're pushing paint, pushing a paint puddle around and pushing it up next to the edge and into the corner. And something else that you want to be aware of also is where you place your hand. I don't have to worry about anything because I haven't painted over here yet, but be mindful of where you're resting your hand. You can also kind of use your pinky as a little bit of a rest, and that way you don't have your whole hand resting on the paper. I've stuck my hand and ruined many a painting that way. It's not ruined, usually can go back over it. So there's a light block, there's probably a middle value block, and I can pick up even more paint and drop it in right over here. And this has the least amount of water, this has some water, and this has a lot of water. So let's try this one and we'll see just how dark this one is. Now I'm going to have to go into that puddle probably a few times just because there isn't a lot of water. And I want to make sure that I don't end up dry brushing anything. So I'm going to go back and pick some more up, and that should be enough for me to paint the rest of this square. I've got enough of a puddle going on here. And as you can see, this is not a perfect thing. It will definitely help you when you move over here to the smaller blocks though. So if I want to maybe do something like this, try this out. Let this be one of your practice squares. And I've got a little bit of yellow still, just probably from the tinted water, but I'm going to paint water right in the square, just like I would if it were paint. And like I said, you can see this. It's not clear water. Okay, so I wouldn't recommend doing the entire your entire project wet and wet like this. You don't want your paper to buckle, but it is fun to try. And so I'm going to pick up a different color. I think I might try this. This is kind of like an earthy red. I believe it's a Venetian red. And I'm just going to pick up the paint right off of the pan. I'm not going to mix it in any water. I'm going to let the water on the paper dilute this. Now, I can stop right there and kind of tip my paper and let this do what it wants to do. And you can see I've got a lot of water down here, and if I were to tip this probably any more, that water would come flooding out. And if I want to get rid of some of that, if I think I've got too much water on my page, take your brush and dry it off on your paper towel completely, and make sure that you run it sideways down the paper towel. Don't ever go like this, you'll ruin the shape of your brush. Make sure it's dry and just kind of stick the tip of your paintbrush into that water and suck up some of that water. Dry it off again, suck up some of that water, and you just kind of keep repeating the process if you think you've got too much water on there. And I can push this paint around. My brush is dry, really dry right now. And I want to push this all the way down to meet the edge of the other square. And you can see I bobbled a little bit right here. I went right out of the square with my water. And that's really not a big deal either, because if I make a mistake like that, what I would do is I would wait until this dries completely, and then I would take a wet brush and wet this edge kind of the best that I could, dry it off, and pick up some of the paint like that. Or I would dab it with a paper towel. So something else that you can try when you're painting, you can go in here and pick up a color. And I'm going to spin my paper around because this is wet over here and I want to paint over here. And I will lay my hand into it. So feel free. Don't feel like you have to keep your paper in the same position. You can change it around and flip it upside down, whatever is most comfortable. So I'm just picking up some paint from this puddle that I've already got down. And I'm going to paint about half of the block, and then I'm going to pick up another color. So I'm going to start a little puddle over here with some red and some pink in it maybe. And make sure that I've got enough water down. And then I'm gonna start painting. And I'm gonna pretend like it's the same color. And I'll pick up some more red. And you can just let these blend. You can let these blend right on the page. You can even pick up some of your red and you can drop it in over here. Now, if you're a person that likes to sew, or you really like fabric, you work with fabric at all, there are some really cool fabrics out there. One of them is called batik, and that's what this reminds me of. And watercolor is like perfect to achieve that same kind of effect as batik fabric. We can move on to different colors too. So I know that I'm going to be painting a leaf as well on my orange, and maybe I'm going to add some yellow and some green. And when I work with yellow, I usually like to wipe a spot off on my palette because yellow can muddy, obviously, really easily. So got some yellow down, and I want to play around with what happens if I paint my leaf. I'm going to paint my leaf yellow, and then I'm going to drop in some green. I want to see what that would look like before I'm actually on before I'm actually painting on my good paper. So I'll clean my brush. I'm going to pick up some green, and this is a really dark green too, so let's see what happens, what this looks like. And I'm really just kind of dropping it in off my brush. I put a little bit of water with this. I went to my palette, mixed in a little bit of water, but it's a very non-diluted. It's more paint than there is water, because I know that once I go into this wet square, if I've got a super diluted puddle of green and I go into this square that's already got water on it, it's going to dilute it even more. So that's something else that you can try. So if you lay down a color, and this is a really cool color. This is Cascade Green, and this is Daniel Smith, and it granulates. And if you use distilled water when you're painting with these on the paints that do have granulation, it will do so even, it's an even stronger effect. So I'm going to paint this. And I'm going to clean my brush. And I'm going to leave it full of water. And then I'm going to drop water. Clean my brush a little bit. And maybe one right here. And what happens is the water is pushing the pigment away. And then just leave it alone and let it dry. Some other things that you can try are, when it's especially wet, you can try adding some salt in. And it kind of has the same effect as dropping water in. We'll drop some in here. You just have to make sure that it's wet. And so right after you paint a block, drop in your salt. Let it dry completely before you try brushing the salt away. I've made the mistake of not letting it dry completely, and you can't really, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's dry, brushing it and then smearing paint all over my paper. So it's usually a hard lesson learned, but that's what I'm telling you now. So you can hit it with a blow dryer if you want, make it dry a little bit quicker, walk away from it, give yourself a break, or you can start on your smaller squares if you'd like. And what I'm going to do is I have this #2 silver black velvet, and I'm going to start painting, and I think I want to start maybe with some blue. I'll make myself a nice little puddle of blue right here. And obviously the smaller the brush is, and you can see I've got a drop of water hanging off the end, and kind of just give it a shake over the paper towel so it doesn't drip on the paper when I'm painting. Obviously the smaller the brush, the less water it's going to hold, just because it's smaller. And same idea. You're kind of going to paint this in more of segments than you are outlining and filling in. And then I end up picking up a little bit more pigment and water, just so I have something to push along the shape. And like I said, that's essentially what you're doing. You're pushing a puddle around the paper. So after you've played around on the bigger blocks and you develop a little bit of confidence with your watercolor, going into these smaller squares and maybe adding your drops of water into it, you won't feel intimidated by the smaller blocks once you've painted all of your blocks. And once these are dry, the next thing that you can do, we can start to embellish these blocks a little bit. And you can use, I have a white gel pen made by Uniball, it's a Signo. And you can also use, watercolor, or you can use Micron pens. And I have several. The nice thing about Micron pens are that they are waterproof and they are acid free. At least I believe. Yes, they are waterproof. Just make sure that they dry first before, if you end up putting, let's say that you end up putting something like this down, And we'll do some leaves here real quick. If you end up putting something like this down and then you decide, well, you know, I think I want to go back over this square with a little bit of watercolor. I don't really like the color. Make sure that this is dry first. Make sure that your micron pen is dry first, and then you can most definitely go over this again with watercolor. Not so much with a gel pen. With your gel pen, and there we go with the hand in the paint. So like I said, be mindful of where your wet paint is. So we can do stuff like polka dots, and there's a face. That's kind of weird. So a good place for inspiration is to look at fabric. Go to your local craft store or Joann's. Look around online, and we can vary the dots here. Something else that you can do that's a lot of fun, when you have all of your squares, and I'm going to flip this around again so I don't do what I just did. When you have all of your squares painted, go in between, and if you like the look of something being sewn, since what we're doing is based off of quilting, you can put in little stitch marks, and I don't think you're going to be able to see this really in the white. There's a couple. Let's try this in the black, since we're working up against a light color. But you can put in some little stitch marks. That would be really cute. Let's see if that'll work on top of the gel pen. You get the idea though. You can even do this in, if I didn't want to use black because the black is kind of hard against the yellow, maybe what I would do is I would pick up a little bit of a darker shade of yellow, and I think I'm going to use a smaller brush for that. You can do all of your detail work with, I think this is a 1. I'm not sure. Nope, this is a size 0. I actually found it. So you can also do this with, like I said, a darker value of the same color, or you can just pick a different color completely, and you can make your stitches like this and just totally go around the square. So that's what this exercise is about. It's about experimenting. It's about adding water into your squares. It's about adding another color in, detailing on top. Go online and go on Pinterest. Take a look at patterned fabric. However you want to embellish and detail out your squares. This is all totally up to you. And play around with your color palette. Try doing a really light square, and then try doing a really dark square of the same color. Just don't add as much water into your puddle. This is about experimentation and having a general idea of what you want to do with your final project and the colors that you want to use. Move on to your smaller squares when you feel like you've had enough of the big ones, and you can detail these out too at the end. So in the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about how to design your final project on your grid paper.